Hey, everybody at Results. I've got to offer an apology. It's been 2 or 3 weeks since I had the honor of getting to speak to all of you, and I wanted to have the few Q&A questions that came in afterwards. I wanted to have them answered much quicker. Things went very, very sideways in my life. So thank you for your patience in me getting back with some of these questions. It's not a lot, but I did want to make sure that because we didn't have time at the end, I could answer them for you. So the first is, are there any leadership books that Drew recommends on particular leaders that tell their life story similar to Richard Branson's Losing My Virginity? The person who submitted this said, I prefer individual people stories versus the generic books like Good to Great. You know what's interesting is I'm like 100% the opposite. I tend to really like the compilation books where people collect a number of stories about other leaders or sort of metadata that says, we've looked at a lot of leaders and these seem to be the things, like Good to Great. That being said, there are some that I have really enjoyed because it really is a preference thing. An odd one here, Mobituaries by Mo Roca, which is a very tongue-in-cheek one. It's Mo Roca, I believe, works on CBS Sunday Morning. He's been a journalist for a long time, but he takes a look at people who or things that he feels deserve a better obituary than they got. And this is everyone from Sammy Davis Jr. to quite literally the station wagon or the rural comedy in the 1960s. And he talks about the death of these individuals or these things, how they impacted the world, and points out some of the things that maybe we've missed that were really important about leadership and people that may have been forgotten. There's a lot of things on the political leaders, the Black political leaders in the United States during the Reconstruction era that a lot of people have simply forgotten about. So it's a light one. And it's, in tiny little pieces, but Mobituaries has got a lot of really interesting things about people you've heard of and people that you haven't that I found really interesting. Just some other ones I jotted down quickly. Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela is a remarkable book to read. Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. I've always had a soft spot in my heart for comedians, and you'll see a couple of them on this list because from the earliest times, we're talking from the court jesters on up, it was always the jesters, the comics, that were often the first to point out the insane or ludicrous things that were going on in society. It was the comedians and the jesters that first pointed out the things in society that didn't make any sense and deserved to be mocked. And so Trevor Noah's book, Born a Crime, about his life in South Africa and what came after that is a really fascinating one. I found Shoe Dog by Phil Knight very interesting. Born Standing Up by Steve Martin, which may not seem like a leader, but what it does do is it talks an awful lot about the idea of overcoming challenges, the idea of consistent behavior every day leading to long-term success. And I also love a lot of his ideas about the obligation that you have when you rise to the top of a profession to try to empower others. And what's interesting is, although Walter Isaacson is most known for the Steve Jobs biography, Leonardo da Vinci's is a fascinating biography that he did as well. So I'm not necessarily into those individual biographies. There's also one called Unbroken, I believe. It was made into a movie. This just popped into, I didn't write it down ahead of time, but the actual book is so much better than the movie and really touches on not only perseverance, but I can't even believe this book. Like the movie doesn't even do justice how insane this guy's life was. But it is a book that you cannot put down once you start. But what really gets me is the talk about forgiveness at the end and moving beyond things were some lessons that I still struggle with to this day. So let's go on to the next question. So those are some of them. Mobituaries, Long Walk to Freedom, Born a Crime, Shoe Dog, Born Standing Up, Leonardo da Vinci, Unbroken. All of these I find really interesting. It's hard too because you start diving into things like Henry Ford and such. But don't forget a lot of these people that have been held up as leaders, we have to separate their really valid ideas that they had and the way they changed the world with the extraordinarily distasteful anti-Semitism of Henry Ford, some of the problems that you find when you dive into Walt Disney's life. Now, it's always difficult when you look at the lives of individuals who grew up in a fundamentally different culture than we did. But a lot of the books that focus on these particularly titans of industries skips over a lot of their really problematic parts of their personality as well. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Is your question, why do you matter, a similar concept as personal purpose? Probably. I mean, ultimately, the reason I ask that question is to get people thinking about whether or not they have an answer and to get people thinking about how powerful it is when you realize that you do or you don't have an answer. And for me, I've always held up why do you matter as an example of the type of question that when you ask people, they tend to learn more being asked than you did doing the asking. I think that things like purpose are incredibly personal, and lots of people talk about the ideas that I do. And whatever sort of makes you realize that there needs to be a ground, like a fundamental driving principle that you try to keep a fundamental part of your behaviors every day, whether you try to make sure your behaviors reflect your purpose or you try to make sure that your behaviors give you evidence that you matter, whatever it is, what's important is that there is a daily commitment to tying your behaviors to this central premise, whether it's that you matter, whether it's that you have a purpose, whether it's you have a passion, whatever the question might be. Yes, it's very similar. It doesn't really matter which approach you choose to take as long as what you are doing is that you have a set of criteria that you are using to evaluate your behaviors every day. And for me, why do you matter isn't so much to say your job is to matter every day. It's that this is a fundamental question that we cannot stop asking ourselves, which is very similar to what is my purpose? Whether you're trying to live a purpose, whether you're trying to prove that you matter, whether you're trying to live values, the fundamental piece is that there is a non-negotiable expectation that you have every day. And whatever word you want to give to that and whatever definition you want or whatever process you use to get that, as long as there is something that is non-negotiable that has to be mirrored in your behaviors every day, that's a key piece. Do you feel having fewer corporate values that are emphasized are more important than trying to cover all the bases? Yes. When the problem is that so often corporate values are a camel. And I first was exposed to that terminology, and I'm sure many of you have heard the terminology of a camel, but it's a horse built by committee. It's a something that everybody tries to make cover everything and it's just ugly and awkward, even if it kind of works sometimes at the end. So a lot of corporate lists of values are camels. They're horses built by committees where you try to shoehorn everything in. And basically as a result of trying to do everything, you say absolutely nothing. I think it's really important. We talk a lot about corporate value alignment, right? You need your, I think I might have said this on the webinar, is that you don't have to worry so much about aligning personal values with corporate values. What you need to do is avoid value conflict. And so I think we don't have to make it clear to people that our job is to treat people with respect or to be dedicated to social justice or to be like, we shouldn't, or customer service. Like we don't need to make clear that's just expected, right? It's a barrier to entry that we shouldn't have to identify. It's like saying if you're going to play hockey, skates are expected. You don't have to say that. It's simply part of the requirements to play the game. What corporate values are the things that you want to focus on above and beyond what is expected out of normal people in organizations that are good people in organizations. So saying that we focus on customer service, okay, but everybody focuses on customer service. When you focus on customer service, are you talking about taking it to a level that nobody else does? Are you Southwest Airlines, right? Because their focus on customer service isn't just making sure people don't give complaints. It's that people become evangelicals. It's the same thing that Apple did, of course. So you have to make sure that when you talk about values, they are the things that are more important than the base expectations that anybody would have, if that makes any sense at all. Make them fewer, make them focused. Know that just because these are the values that you point to doesn't mean they're the only values that are expected. There is an expectation that people in any organization will live up to certain fundamental values. The values of your organization are the ones that you say, these are above and beyond. These aren't just going to be what people can expect from us. These are the values that will define us. That is different. And Southwest has done that, for instance, right? There's a Container Store down in the United States that does the same sort of thing where I think they call it man in the desert. They probably changed that now because we've seen that it should be person in the desert selling. That when somebody walks in, customer service is a value. But for this particular company, they say when somebody walks in the door, we treat them like they've just come from the desert. And we don't just get them a glass of water. We think of everything else that they could possibly want that they don't even know. So that's not about customer service being a value, right? It's something you do. It's about defining you. There's a difference there. And I think there are some companies where they don't just say, we're going to give what people expect. They say, no, we will go so far in our focus on this that it will define who we are. For Apple, that probably is innovation, right? So it's not just, oh, we're going to be innovative. You're dead if you're not innovative. But only make it a company value if you are going to sacrifice other things in the name of innovation. So in many ways, your corporate values have to be the values you say, we will sacrifice things that other people do in order to be better at this. And I think that is a big differentiation. Do it fewer, and do it more in depth. The things you focus on aren't just the things that you hope will make people accept you as good. They're the things that you want people to define you as something different. How much of your material comes from personal experiences versus reading and research? That's a really good question. I think what's interesting is that eventually you get to a point where it's really hard to separate the two, because when you're at the university, it's a lot based on research. It's a lot based on theory. But what happens is when I start speaking now, more and more it pulls from personal experience. And the thing about my job is that my personal experience is often a compilation of other people's experience. When you read my book or you listen to my presentations, you'll find that a lot of what I'm telling are other people's stories and other people's insights that they shared with me. And those insights, some of them come from research. I guess now, honestly, it's 60-40 in terms of experience, although the experience is usually with other people's research, right? So um, my particular work that I do, the longer you get into what you do, the more you focus on a specific thing as your expertise. So more and more now I talk about the day one process, and I talk about operationalizing leadership values, defining and turning values into questions. And I used to talk about more when it comes to leadership, but this became something I focused more and more specifically on. That being said, when I talk about any of my work, it does come from both heavily research-based, and a big part of that is the work of Kuzin and Posner and the Leadership Challenge. A lot of their research is what informs my focus on values. And then a great deal of it also comes from sort of anecdotal compilation books and research. So there's the actual like physical research that you get from a university, but there's also books like Chip and Dan Heath's The Power of Moments, which talks about what makes a defining moment and draws from all kinds of behavioral and psychological research. Daniel Pink's work does the same thing. Well, it's a book by Daniel Pink. What it effectively is a compilation, particularly the book Drive, for instance, The Surprising Science of What Motivates Us, is basically a curated collection of scientific and academic research that talks about what drives people. So a lot of the work that I do is those things start to inform what I talk about. And so, by now it's all incredibly mixed, right? Do I read academic papers? Really not. But do I pick up books that talk about compiling the overall themes and things that have been learned from those academic papers? Things like Daniel Pink's Drive, some of Malcolm Gladwell's books do this. And then you also take things that are a very individual person's experience, such as all of Patrick Lencioni's books. And, we talked about books earlier in these answers, but I'll give you now. Chip and Dan Heath's The Power of Moments is an extraordinary book. The Opposable Mind by Roger Martin is well worth picking up. Adam Grant's Give and Take is an excellent book as well. These are all examples of books that reach out and in one compilation draw in a lot of either business test cases or psychological research that gets into why people behave the way they do and how to get the most out of individuals in a way that doesn't abuse or exploit them, I think is really important. So I have a mix of both. I always share stories that people share with me and that I have myself. But then there's always what can you learn from these books? What can you learn from these studies that can then inform and completely and constantly refine what we're doing? So it comes as a little bit of both. I do less sort of reading academic papers since I left the university, without a doubt, though. But I still love getting that information. I just prefer to read it through the filter of somebody like Gladwell or Pink or Lencioni or Grant, who sort of compiles it and presents it in a way that's a heck of a lot more fun to read. And let's see, could I provide some examples and tools for elevating versus escalating? My God, I wish I had more right now. This is such a problematic statement for me. One of the things that, and I might have said this on the webinar, one of the things that has been really interesting to learn recently, when you put out a book, there's immediately 3 things you wish you had included and 3 things that you wish you hadn't put in it. And elevate versus escalate is something that I wish I could edit when I go back in, because I say leaders always elevate, they never escalate. And one of the things that the world is showing me right now is that that is a flawed statement, because there are some things that demand escalation. There are some things that aren't about trying to compromise. You should not compromise, and you should not be afraid to escalate when matters of human rights and social justice are on the line. And I think this idea that, oh, we always have to be open-minded and we always have to build bridges and dialogue sometimes allows injustice to fester, right? Because we want to agree to disagree. And as a result, there is no point where someone puts their foot down and says, there should no longer be dialogue on this, all right? We should not discuss whether Black Lives Matter. This is not a dialogue anymore. It is a fact, as an example that's really relevant right now. And so I think that that's a challenge for me, the elevate versus escalate piece now. It may be my next book when I talk about, okay, how do we determine when is those situations that do call for escalation? Is there ever one? And if so, what differentiates those moments from others? Because I think leaders should always strive to elevate before escalate. But I think it was a flawed statement for me to say you should never escalate. And the question for me that I'm struggling with right now is, what criteria can we use to determine when escalation is necessary? Because if to fail to do so, to constantly try to elevate actually gets to the point where those who are perpetuating injustice use the fact that you're always trying to elevate and never escalate to make sure that the status quo is maintained. And I think that that's an important thing I want to dive into. For one specific example that I do use, here is how I give an example of a tool for business email. All email really, but I know that a lot of our lives are driven by email. And I think that everybody out there has received an email that made you talk to the screen, usually with some specific words. You get the email, you look, and you're like, and so what I used, the urge to respond to those emails, to elevate, to escalate those emails is so overwhelming. Like we've all sat next to someone and we've just heard from their desk, cough, right? They've just gotten that email. So here is a strategy that I use for those emails. When I get one of those emails, I open up Word, all right? Not Gmail, not Outlook, not whatever your mail server is, nothing with a send button. And I actually write the email I want to write back, all right? Like it's nasty, it's vicious, it is the darkest parts of all of my soul. It's like some Game of Thrones email version. Like I just write every ragey thing that's in it. And then I save it on a USB key that's password protected in a folder called This Could Have Happened. So I write the nasty email where I just let loose everything that popped through my mind when I first got it. And then I put it in this folder. And then I go and I listen to my favorite song. Yeah, have a nap, go for a 20-minute walk. Yeah, but I think most of us don't have that kind of time in the day, but you have time to listen to your favorite song. If you don't, your schedule too tight. Okay, there's part of the problem there. And then I come back and I open up that folder where I saved that nasty email. But in that folder, I've saved every one of those emails that have come in over the last several years. And I just open up one of my responses, not to the one I just got, any other one. And I read it. And I think to myself, that could have happened. Because I look back now and I realize that if I had sent that email, even though it reflected how I truly felt at that moment, if I had sent it, my career would be worse, my relationships would be worse, things that matter would be damaged. And what I do is after I read one of the previous ones, I close it and I open up Outlook or I open up whatever my mail server is and I write the elevate email. So let the worst part of you out. All right, separate key, password protected, but let the worst parts of you out, because what it does is it allows that decompression that gives you the strength to elevate after that. I have a folder of the worst email replies I have ever written, and they are terrifying. If people read some of them, they would think this is a terrible human being, but we've all felt that way. But what I do is I write it, I close it, I walk away even just for a moment. I put something into my brain that I know causes happiness. Then I return and I read some of my other mistakes or some of my other potential mistakes. And I am reminded that as good as it felt to write, my life is better because I didn't hit send. But I think what gets us is if we deny ourselves the opportunity to write it, it becomes harder for us to resist sending it. And I think that is an example of elevate versus escalate that helps me on a daily basis. That being said, this particular piece of advice, as much as I believe that those three words, elevate, don't escalate, will save jobs and relationships, I will be open that one of the things I'm struggling with right now is how is it flawed and how can I better present it in a way that it acknowledges that it is not all encompassing. And I don't know how to do that yet. But I do know that I have come to recognize that trying to agree to disagree allows many negative things to continue to foster or to fester and make the world a worse place, because there are things that need to be stood up for. And so the question is when, how do we know the difference, and how do we stand up for them in a way that does escalate what is necessary, but doesn't disintegrate into something that never solves problems. That's all that came in, my friends. I hope that has been at all helpful. And it was such a pleasure to have the chance to talk to all of you. Never hesitate to reach out directly, drew@drewdudley.com, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks, everyone. And thanks to everyone for giving me the opportunity to be a part of your community. Take care.